The radio crackled once, then went silent. 5 people were bleeding in the snow, trapped inside the Frostfall Range with temperatures dropping below -30, and the man with the power to save them had just made his decision. Colonel Marcus Vance's voice came through cold and flat, the way a man speaks when he's already moved on. "She's a nurse, not a recovery specialist. End the search." The helicopters peeled away from the mountain wall and vanished into the white. Emily Carter heard every word through the emergency radio she wasn't supposed to have. She looked at the injured men around her, one barely conscious, one losing blood faster than she could slow it. And then she looked at the storm. Then she got to work. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the end. Hit like, follow my channel, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Silver Creek Medical Center was not a glamorous posting. It sat on the eastern edge of Raven Hollow, a mid-sized military support town that existed mostly because the base did, and the base existed mostly because the mountains did, and nobody with any real career ambition stayed longer than their mandatory rotation. The hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled heat. The cafeteria served the same 4 meals on a rotating schedule that everyone had memorized by their second week. The staff called it the Creek, and they said it the way people name something they've mostly made their peace with. Emily Carter had been at the Creek for 11 months. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and the kind of person who moved through a room without disturbing it. She kept her brown hair pulled back tight during shifts. She answered questions directly and didn't add anything extra to her sentences. She showed up 7 minutes early to every shift and left only after her notes were finished, which usually meant she was the last one in the ward. The other nurses liked her well enough. The senior staff treated her like a filing cabinet, necessary, unobtrusive, easy to overlook. Major Dennis Harlow, the chief medical officer, had said it plainly during her last performance review. "You're reliable, Carter. That's not nothing." He'd said it like it was a compliment. She'd nodded, gathered her paperwork, and walked out. She had not corrected him. There were things about Emily Carter that were not in her Silver Creek personnel file. There were things about Emily Carter that were in a different file entirely, one that required a security clearance she technically still held, buried under 11 months of shift reports and medication logs, and the general administrative forgetting that happens when someone decides to become invisible. She had chosen Raven Hollow specifically. She'd wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere functional, somewhere nobody would ask too many questions about what she'd done before. She'd gotten exactly that. What she hadn't anticipated was Colonel Marcus Vance. Vance commanded the 14th Mountain Response Brigade out of Fort Aldrin, 40 minutes north of the creek, and he came through the medical center 3 or 4 times a month for coordination meetings. He was 51, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of squared-off jawline that photographs well. He spoke to physicians and never to nurses unless he needed something handed to him. The first time Emily had crossed paths with him, she'd been restocking a supply cabinet in the corridor outside the conference room, and he'd asked her to bring more water for the table without making eye contact. She'd brought the water. He had not said thank you, and she had not expected him to. The second time, he'd waved her out of a hallway he wanted cleared before a classified briefing, the kind of gesture you'd use on a dog that had wandered somewhere inconvenient. She'd moved. He'd already forgotten she existed before she cleared the corner. The third time was the day before the Frostfall deployment, and he'd walked past her entirely, mid-conversation with Major Harlow, discussing the upcoming mountain rescue exercise as though the corridor were empty. "Nursing staff on standby," Vance had said. "Standard protocol. These recovery ops don't need medical dragging along until we're inbound." Harlow had agreed. Of course he had. Emily had kept walking. The deployment was technically classified as a joint training exercise. 3 squads from the 14th, 2 from the attached Special Operations Support Team, a flight crew, and a 4-person medical contingent from the Creek. They were mapping rescue routes through the northern Frostfall Range, a stretch of mountain terrain that the military had been trying to formally document for 2 years. The range was brutal in summer. In late November, with the season's first serious storm system moving in from the northwest, it was something else entirely. Emily had looked at the weather reports the night before departure. She'd looked at them twice. She had not said anything to Major Harlow because Harlow had already signed off on the timeline, and he didn't like being questioned by staff he categorized as support. She had, however, packed differently than the standard medical kit suggested. She'd added a secondary thermal layer, a compact emergency transmitter that she'd kept from her previous life and never formally surrendered, a tourniquet kit that went beyond protocol, and a thermal locator card she'd slid into the inner lining of her jacket so automatically she hadn't even thought about it. Muscle memory. She'd done it the way you check a door lock twice before leaving. Not because you think something's wrong, but because your body understands something your brain hasn't fully articulated. The helicopters lifted out of Fort Aldrin at 0630 in Mutit. The crash happened at 11:47. The lead helicopter, callsign Ridgeback 1, hit a downdraft coming off the western face of the Frostfall at an altitude of 9,000 feet. The pilots fought it for 11 seconds. Emily knew this because she counted, the way she'd been trained to count, her hands flat on her knees, body braced, eyes forward. At second 12, the rotor caught a gust and the aircraft went sideways. She remembered the sound more than the impact. A groan of metal, a crack that was physical as much as audible, and then white. She came back to herself face down in snow, the emergency transmitter digging into her sternum through 2 layers of jacket. Her ears were ringing, her left shoulder felt wrong. Not broken, she decided after a moment of deliberate assessment, probably separated. She pushed herself up with her right arm. The helicopter was 30 feet away, on its side, one rotor still moving with a slow, wounded spin. Black smoke was starting to curl from somewhere underneath the hull. She moved toward it. Later, one of the surviving soldiers, Corporal Jared Tuck, 23 years old, a foot of dried blood down the left side of his face, would say that Emily Carter had been the first person upright after the crash. He'd say it like it surprised him, and it had. It surprised a lot of people in the hours and days that followed. The immediate count was 7 survivors, though that number changed quickly. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Delmont, had not survived impact. Sergeant First Class Ray Okafor had a compound fracture of the right tibia. The bone had broken clean through the skin, and he was in the snow with his back against wreckage, breathing through his teeth, not screaming because he was the kind of man who wouldn't let himself. Specialist Gwen Pauley had a head wound that was bleeding significantly. Emily got to her second and had pressure on it within 4 minutes. Lieutenant Brennan Solis, the ranking officer after the crash, had 2 cracked ribs and a concussion he was trying to minimize. The other 3, Corporal Tuck, Specialist Dario Ames, and Specialist Priya Nwosu, were mobile, bruised, and increasingly frightened. Emily triaged them in 11 minutes. She did it without speaking more than necessary, without explaining what she was doing or why, moving from one person to the next with a focus that was not frantic. She pulled supplies from the wreckage methodically, choosing what had a use and leaving what didn't, a kind of triage applied to equipment the same way she'd applied it to bodies. What are you doing?" Tuck asked, watching her splint Okafor's leg with a piece of aircraft frame and 2 torn sections of cargo strap. "Splinting his leg," she said. "I know, but are you trained for that?" "Yes." He watched her tie off the final strap. Okafor was pale and slick with sweat, but his jaw had unclenched slightly. Pressure reduced, blood flow controlled. It wasn't a hospital splint. It would hold. "What do we do?" Tuck asked. Emily stood, surveyed the wreckage, the slope, the sky. "First we move him away from the aircraft. The smoke's going to get worse." They moved him. The emergency radio in the wrecked helicopter was still partially functional. It had a range problem. The signal was bouncing off the rock face and degrading, but it could receive, even when it couldn't transmit cleanly. Emily had discovered this within the first hour, which was why she was near the cockpit trying to boost the antenna alignment when Colonel Vance's transmission came through. She recognized his voice immediately. He was talking to someone at Fort Aldrin Command. She caught the call signs, caught the map coordinates, caught the phrase "search window" closing in the clipped, decisive tone of a man who had already made up his mind and was completing the paperwork. Then, "She's a nurse, not a recovery specialist. End the search." Static. Then the sound of the storm filling in where the radio had been. Emily stayed crouched by the cockpit for a moment. The cold was specific and deliberate at this altitude. Not just temperature, but pressure. Something that pushed into the joints, and behind the eyes. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the smoke smell and the tilt of the fuselage and the distance to the tree line that she'd been calculating since the crash. She was also aware of the transmitter in her inner jacket pocket, the one she hadn't turned on yet. She hadn't turned it on because a signal from that transmitter would bring a specific kind of attention she wasn't ready for. Not yet. Not while there were variables she hadn't controlled. She tucked the radio situation away, filed it, came back out of the cockpit and walked back to where the survivors were gathered, Okafor propped against the best wind shelter they'd managed to establish so far. "We need to build something better before dark," she said. "The temperature's going to drop another 15 degrees minimum." "Shouldn't we wait for rescue?" Specialist Ames asked. He was 21, had been on his first major deployment, and was working very hard to keep his voice from doing something he'd be embarrassed by later. "We're waiting," Emily said. "We're also building shelter. Both things can happen." The shelter took 2 hours. She used the intact sections of the aircraft fuselage, oriented them against the predominant wind direction using a reading she'd taken from the snowdrift patterns, which told her the direction and consistency of the prevailing wind as clearly as a compass, and reinforced the gaps with packed snow and sections of cargo netting from the wreck. Tuck and Wosu worked beside her, following directions without argument after about 15 minutes of watching her operate. Solis, the lieutenant, had watched from a seated position for the first 40 minutes. His concussion made him unreliable for physical tasks, and he knew it. He was the ranking officer, and the fact that he was not leading this situation was something he was visibly processing. "Carter," he said, when she brought him water from melted snow she'd heated using a chemical pack from the medical kit. "What exactly is your training?" "Enough," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer that's useful right now." She handed him the water. "Drink all of it. Your brain needs hydration more than mine does." He drank. He didn't push further, not then. At 1800, the temperature dropped. At 1830, the shelter held. Okafor's leg was stable. Polly's head wound had stopped bleeding under sustained pressure and a proper bandage from the kit. And Emily had an inventory of their remaining food, water, chemical heating capacity, and medical supplies organized in her head with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with nursing school. She let them sleep in rotation. She took first watch herself. In the dark, with the storm still moving overhead, and the cold doing what cold does to everything, she made her decisions about the next 4 days. She ran through routes, calculated pace for a group with one non-ambulatory member, thought about the checkpoint at Ridgeback Station that she knew existed because she'd studied these mountains before the deployment, not from the briefing documents, but from topographic surveys she'd obtained through channels that her Creek colleagues didn't know she had. She thought about the transmitter. She left it off. Day 2 began with Sergeant Okafor asking her to help him urinate, which he managed with the stoic pragmatism of a man who'd decided dignity was a resource he couldn't afford to waste, and ended with Emily making a decision that Solis had nightmares about for years afterward, though he would eventually call it the decision that saved all of them. They needed to move. The storm had passed its leading edge, but the secondary system behind it was larger. She'd tracked its movement by barometric pressure. She had a small gauge, the kind some hikers carried, that she'd packed without thinking too much about it. And the window they had was narrowing. "Okafor can't walk," Solis said. "I know. We can't carry him through mountain terrain." "We're not going to carry him," Emily said. "We're going to build a sled." Silence. "With what?" Tuck asked. She showed him. The aircraft had cargo panels, composite material, smooth-bottomed, roughly rectangular. She'd identified them on day 1. Combined with the cargo strapping for handles and a rope system that distributed weight between 2 people at a controlled angle, it was not elegant and it was not comfortable for Okafor, but it moved. She tested the physics herself before they committed to it, dragging a weighted pack over a 15-meter stretch of slope to check resistance and control. "You're going to pull me on a sled," Okafor said, flat. "Yes?" "Through a mountain range. The first section is mostly lateral. The grade doesn't get serious until day 3. He stared at her. He had the look of a man revising something. "Okay," he said. They moved out at 0800. By midday on day 2, something had shifted in the group dynamic that nobody named directly, but everyone felt. Tuck had started checking with Emily before he did anything, not because Solis had lost authority, but because Emily was consistently, quietly right. Polly, who was an experienced specialist and not easily impressed, had started mimicking Emily's movement patterns through the snow, the way she chose footing and read the surface ahead. And Wosu, who was the quietest of the group, simply watched. "Who taught you to read terrain like that?" Polly asked at one point, when Emily had steered them around what looked like solid ground, but would have been a hidden drop. Emily was adjusting her grip on the sled rope. "Keep your weight back when the slope tilts right. The crust there is thinner." Polly adjusted her weight. "You didn't answer." "I noticed." Polly almost smiled. "Are you always like this?" Emily thought about it. "Pretty much." On the afternoon of day 2, they came across evidence that they were not alone on the mountain. Emily saw it first: boot prints in the snow, military pattern treads, moving on a parallel course about 300 meters east of their current position. She stopped the group with a hand signal that was so automatic she didn't think about it, and Tuck, who'd been in the military long enough to know what a hand signal meant, stopped immediately and put his hand on the person behind him. "What?" Solis asked quietly. Emily pointed. He looked. His expression changed. "Those aren't ours." "No. The Frostfall border range. There's been documented." "I know," she said. "So what do we do?" She studied the prints, the stride pattern, the depth, the direction. She looked at the angle of the light and calculated how old they were. 3 to 4 hours. Moving north. "We go southwest," she said. "Adds half a day." "Half a day with Okafor on a sled?" "Yes." Solis looked at her. At the prints, at the terrain ahead. He was a good lieutenant. She'd concluded that by now, which meant he understood when someone knew more than him about a specific thing. "Southwest," he said. They went southwest. Day 2 ended in a narrow rock shelter that Emily had spotted from half a mile out, tucked into a cliff face in a way that was invisible until you were at the right angle. She didn't explain how she'd known to look for it. Nobody asked. Okafor's leg had swollen inside the splint. She checked it by feel and by his responses to specific pressure points, because she didn't have imaging and couldn't get any. The bone was stable, the swelling was circulatory, concerning but manageable. She adjusted the splint tension and gave him the last of the anti-inflammatory medication from the kit. "You're going to run out soon," he said, watching her inventory what was left. "I know." "Then what?" She repacked the kit. "Then I improvise." He was quiet for a moment. "Carter. That radio call you heard, the one about ending the search." She looked at him. "I was conscious enough to hear you when you came back from the cockpit," he said. "You were quiet about it." "You didn't tell the others?" "No." "Why?" She settled back against the rock wall. The shelter was dark except for the chemical light she'd activated at the lowest sustainable setting. Outside, the wind was making sounds that were not quite like anything natural. "Because they needed to focus on surviving," she said, "not on being angry." Okafor considered this for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. It was not a question. Emily looked at the exit of the shelter, reading the darkness. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have 4 hours." Okafor watched her for another moment. Then he closed his eyes. She stayed awake. In the silence of the rock shelter, with 5 people sleeping around her and a military force they hadn't identified somewhere to the northeast, and a commanding officer who'd decided she didn't matter enough to save, Emily Carter did what she had always done when the situation asked for it. She made a plan. She pulled out the emergency transmitter from her inner pocket, turned it over in her hands, thought about the signal it would send and what that signal would activate and who would come when it did. She clicked it on for exactly 6 seconds, a specific coded duration that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what to listen for, and then clicked it off. Then she put it away, pulled her thermal layer tighter, and watched the entrance of the shelter until it was someone else's turn. 400 miles south, in a facility that didn't appear on any public military map, a receiver registered a 6-second burst on a frequency that had been dormant for 11 months. The officer on duty looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he reached for a different phone. 400 miles south, in a facility that didn't appear on any public military map, a receiver registered a 6-second burst on a frequency that had been dormant for 11 months. The officer on duty looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he reached for a different phone. The call lasted 40 seconds. The man on the other end of the line asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and said nothing after that except a single acknowledgement that the call was being escalated. Within 6 minutes, a second call went to a third person. Within 20 minutes, a file was pulled from a classified archive. Within an hour, a decision had been made in a room that Emily Carter would never be told about, by people whose names she would never learn. And that decision set something in motion that would not arrive for another 2 days. She didn't know any of this. She was watching the entrance to a rock shelter in the Frostfall Range, measuring wind patterns by the sound they made against stone and keeping count of the hours. Morning on day 3 came in gray and mean, the kind of light that didn't so much illuminate as reveal. Everything flat and stripped, the snow reflecting back a sky that had already decided it wasn't finished with them. Emily was up before anyone else, which was not a decision but a reflex. She'd been tracking Okafor's breathing through the night by sound, calibrating it against the temperature drop she'd measured with the gauge, and she'd slept in 40-minute increments the way she'd learned to sleep in conditions where continuous rest was a liability. She had the water heating before Tuck's eyes opened. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "Drink this when it's ready." He sat up slowly, working his jaw, checking his own body the way people do when they've slept on stone. His face wound from the crash had crusted properly overnight, no fresh bleeding, which was the right outcome. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since day 2, like a man who'd misidentified something in dim light and was still adjusting. "We doing the southwest route all day?" "Until we clear the Aldrin Pass junction," she said. "Then we angle north." "How far is the checkpoint from there?" 2 days? He absorbed this. 2 more days. He was doing the math on their supplies. She could see it on his face. "We're going to run low on everything." "I know." "So how Tuck?" She kept her voice level. "One problem at a time." He nodded, didn't push. She appreciated that about him. He was frightened, genuinely frightened in the way that young soldiers got when the training scenarios stopped matching reality, but he channeled it into motion rather than noise. That was workable. Okafor was harder. His leg had gotten worse overnight. Not catastrophically, but enough that when Emily checked the splint in the early light, she saw the discoloration had spread another 2 inches up the calf, and his response to pressure at the knee was sharper than it had been at midnight. She pressed 2 specific points above the fracture site without telling him what she was checking for, and he hissed through his nose but held still. "Give it to me straight," he said. "You need the circulation maintained. The sled position's been putting intermittent pressure on the wrong point." She was already adjusting the rigging, adding a secondary support at a different angle. "I should have caught it last night." "You did catch it. It's morning." She didn't respond to that. She worked the rigging for another 4 minutes. Tested it again. The angle was better. Not ideal. Ideal was a hospital and a vascular surgeon and imaging equipment, but better. "Will I lose the leg?" Okafor asked. She looked at him directly. "Not if we move." He held her gaze for a moment. Ray Okafor had been in the military for 12 years. He'd served in conditions she didn't know the specifics of, though she could read the general shape of them and how he held himself, how he processed pain. He nodded once. "Then let's move." They were 2 hours out from the shelter when Nwosu found the supply cache. It was half buried under a shelf of packed ice on the north face of a boulder that they passed because Emily had taken them 50 meters further east than the most direct route. She'd done it without explaining why, navigating by something that looked like instinct but wasn't. Nwosu had looked up at the right moment, seen the edge of an equipment bag, and said, "Wait," in the quiet voice of someone who wasn't sure they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. Emily reached it first, cut the ice away with the folding blade from her jacket pocket, another item that had never made it onto the creek's standard kit list, and unzipped the bag. Inside, 4 emergency ration packets, a thermal blanket folded to brick size, water purification tablets, 2 chemical heat packs, and a flare gun with 3 cartridges. The group stared at it. "Is that Ames started. "Forward emergency cache," Emily said. She was reading the markings on the ration packets. Mountain Response Brigade. These are standard preposition drops for extraction operations. Solis moved closer. We're on a documented cache route? We are now. Shinta. There was a beat of Shint in which everyone calculated what this meant, that she had navigated them onto a route that had resources, not by luck, but by knowledge she hadn't explained and that nobody had asked her to explain. Polly said it quietly, almost to herself. You knew this was here. Emily loaded 3 ration packets into her pack and handed the other items to Tuck for distribution. She did not confirm or deny. Eat, she said. We need 20 minutes, and then we're moving. The food made a difference that was more psychological than caloric, though both mattered. People who have been managing hunger for over 40 hours respond to eating the way machines respond to fuel. The change isn't immediate, but it's real, and it redistributes itself through every system. By the time they'd cleared the Aldrin Pass junction 2 hours later, the group's pace had noticeably improved. Even Nwosu, who had been silent to the point of concerning, had color back in her face. The flare gun Emily kept. She did not say why. The enemy patrol that had been tracking north the day before had apparently stopped tracking north. Emily noticed the sign change around 1400 when she cut across a ridgeline and saw a different set of prints. Same pattern, different group, moving in a direction that made no navigational sense unless you were searching for something. Or someone. She didn't stop the group. She moved them faster instead, adjusting their path by degrees. Small corrections that anyone watching from a distance would have read as terrain following rather than evasion, because it was both. She was reading the terrain and evading simultaneously, the way you learn to do when the two things stop being separate operations and collapse into one. Solis came up beside her. You're moving us faster. Yes. Why? She didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. He looked out at the expanse of snow ahead, then back to the east. Are we being tracked? He asked. Possibly. Carter. His voice dropped. I need to know what you know. She glanced at him. There's a second patrol moving in a search pattern. Our current route keeps us below their sight lines if we maintain pace. If we slow down, we lose that margin. He processed this. How do you know it's a search pattern and not transit? Stride spacing. The turns are too deliberate for transit. Solis was quiet for a few steps. You've tracked people in terrain before. Yes. As what? What were you before the creek? She checked her bearing off the ridgeline. Keep Okafor's sled angle down. The slope's going to shift in about 40 meters. He adjusted without answering. She felt him filing the question away, not dropping it. She knew the type, had served beside the type, but putting it somewhere, it would wait until he had the bandwidth for it. Good. She needed him functional, right now, not curious. By 1600, they had put the patrol signs behind them and were descending into a lower valley that offered better tree cover and, crucially, better protection against wind exposure for the night. Emily picked their campsite by a set of criteria she walked through in her head automatically. Defensible approach, minimal cold sink from the ground, adequate overhead cover, sight lines to the most probable approach vectors from multiple directions. She chose a spot against a stand of gnarled spruce trees that had grown into each other at the base, creating a natural windbreak that would have taken 30 minutes to manufacture artificially. The ground under the trees was 3 degrees warmer than the open slope, which made a real difference. Here, she said. Nobody argued anymore. That had stopped happening at some point on day 2. While Tuck and Ames assembled the campsite, they'd gotten efficient at it, needed less instruction each time. Emily checked Okafor's leg with the careful focus she'd been applying to it every 6 hours. The adjusted rigging had helped. The discoloration had stabilized rather than advancing, and his circulation response was improved enough that she recalculated the risk level from critical watch to serious watch, which was a meaningful distinction even if it didn't sound like one. You know what's funny, Okafor said while she worked. Tell me. Harlow, at the creek. He told me once you were good at paperwork. He laughed, which turned into a controlled wince. Said you were thorough. She tied off the final adjustment. He wasn't wrong. No, but... He looked at her hands, the confident, precise movements that had nothing to do with filling out forms. Paperwork's not what saved my leg. She packed the kit away. How's the pain? Manageable. A pause. You're not going to talk about it, are you? Whatever you were. I'm going to get you to that checkpoint, she said. That's what I am right now. He accepted this. After a moment, he said, Fair enough. Oh, that night, Solis found the piece of the emergency radio they'd brought from the wreck. A section of it, actually, the receiver module that Emily had detached and carried without telling anyone. Because she'd known it might be useful, and she hadn't explained because explaining took time she didn't have. He found it when he was checking the supply pack distribution. This is from the helicopter, he said. Yes. You took it. Yes. He set it down carefully. Does it work? In receive mode, the transmit range is too degraded to be useful, so you've been able to hear what's happening. She'd been waiting for this conversation. Yes. And? She met his eyes. She'd decided sometime in the past 12 hours that Solis had earned the truth, or at least the part of it that directly affected the group's situation. There's no active search operation running. The rescue was called off. The silence that followed had weight to it. Called off, he repeated. His voice had gone very flat. Within 2 hours of the crash. On what grounds? She thought about Vance's voice, the casual dismissal of it, the way he'd said she's a nurse like it was a diagnosis. I don't have the full picture, she said. What I have is enough to know that rescue isn't coming. We're walking to that checkpoint. Solis sat down on a supply pack. He was quiet for long enough that Emily began planning what to say next. But then he looked up, and what was on his face wasn't panic. It was the particular kind of cold anger that develops in people who've invested their lives in a system and discovered a crack they didn't know was there. How long have you known? He asked. Since day one. You didn't tell us. No. Why? Because you needed to focus, she said. Not be angry. There's a difference between information and useful information. The facts didn't change what we had to do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. A single, deliberate movement, the kind that indicates not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The acceptance that a decision had been made by someone with better information, and that the decision had been correct. Okay, he said. I need you to keep it between us. For now. For now, he agreed, and she trusted that he would, because she'd been watching him for 3 days, and she knew the kind of officer he was. Day 4 opened with crisis before sunrise. Emily had been tracking Polly's headache since day 1. Polly had mentioned it twice, minimized it twice, and Emily had noted both the symptom and the minimization with equal attention. Head wounds in cold environments carried particular risks. She'd been watching Polly's pupil response every morning with a pen light from the kit, checking for the specific asymmetry that indicated pressure buildup. On day 4 morning, she found it. The left pupil was 2 millimeters larger than the right. Polly was sitting up, moving, answering questions coherently, but she had a headache she rated as a 7, and her reaction time on a quick visual tracking test Emily ran without explaining it was measurably slower than 2 days before. I need you to tell me everything you're feeling, Emily said. Polly looked at her, then at the pen light. You're concerned. I'm checking. You've been checking every morning, Polly exhaled. My head's worse than yesterday. I didn't want to say it. I know. Is it bad? Emily looked at the pupil response one more time. The honest answer was, it might be. A slow intracranial bleed caught early could be managed with reduced activity and careful monitoring. Left alone, in the cold, with exertion demands, the outcomes got significantly worse very quickly. It means today we manage your load, Emily said. No carrying, no hauling on the sled, you walk. That's it. I can do more than that. Not today. Polly started to argue and then stopped because something in Emily's tone had shifted into a register that Polly apparently recognized as non-negotiable. She leaned back. Fine. Emily adjusted the day's plan. With Polly's load redistributed, they lost speed. With the reduced speed, they lost margin. The calculation was uncomfortable but manageable. They could still make the approach to the checkpoint by end of day 5 if nothing else changed. She ran the numbers twice and held the adjustment. Then Ames twisted his ankle on a snow-covered rock shelf at 0830, and the day recalculated itself without being asked. He didn't fall, caught himself against Nwosu, who caught herself against a tree trunk, but the ankle was immediately and visibly wrong. Not broken, her assessment said, but a significant lateral sprain that would make load-bearing painful and slow. Not impossible, but slow. He looked at her with an expression that was half apology, half dread. "Carter, I'm sorry, Sit down," she said. Not harsh, just directive. She wrapped the ankle with the last of the compression bandage, leaving herself no secondary supply. Fitted it inside his boot so the boot itself provided additional stabilization. Had him stand, tested his weight-bearing tolerance, watched his gait over a 10-meter walk. Slower, workable, just barely. "Can you keep pace if I adjust the route?" she asked. He was white-knuckled but nodding. Yes. She chose to believe him. The adjusted route added 2 hours and took them through terrain that was harder on everyone but required less of the specific demands, steep descents, rough lateral traverses, that would have destroyed Ames's ankle within an hour. Emily navigated it from memory and instinct, and a topographic sense she'd developed in environments far less forgiving than this one, moving them through a section of old glacier bed that was brutal on the legs but mercifully flat. Nobody complained. Not because they didn't want to. Tuck made a sound at one point that was purely involuntary, a guttural expression of physical exhaustion, but because the person setting the pace hadn't complained, and there was something about following someone who hadn't complained that made it harder to start. By midday, they had covered more distance than Emily's adjusted projection, because Ames was tougher than she'd expected and Tuck was compensating on Okafor's sled in a way that actually improved their efficiency. She recalculated again. End of day 4, they could be within striking distance of the checkpoint approach. End of day 5, they could be there. She moved the timeline up in her head, said nothing about it. Around 1300, Nwosu, who had been quiet to the point that Emily had been checking on her every 30 minutes, came up alongside without being asked. "I was in signals," Nwosu said. No preamble. "Before I cross-trained, I know what that receiver module can do, and I know why you're still carrying it." Emily looked at her. "You're not just listening," Nwosu said. "You're tracking traffic to see if anyone's moving into this grid. So you know whether we're going to run into the wrong people before we run into them." A beat. "That's not standard nursing school," Nwosu said. "No," Emily said. "Whatever you were," Nwosu said, "I'm glad you're here." She said it without ceremony, the way people say true things when they've given up on making them sound impressive. Then she dropped back and didn't ask another question. Emily kept moving. The ambush, if that was the right word for it, happened at 15:20. They came around the shoulder of a ridgeline and found themselves looking at 3 armed figures in cold-weather tactical gear that didn't carry any national marking Emily could identify from 40 meters. The figures were as surprised as the survivors were. The hesitation lasted about 2 seconds on both sides. Emily acted in the second. She already had the flare gun in her hand. She'd been carrying it accessible since the previous morning, another decision she hadn't explained, and she fired one cartridge at a 45-degree upward angle that sent a burning orange trail arcing over the ridgeline and lit the sky above them with enough visibility to be seen for miles in every direction. Not at the figures, over them. A signal. The figures looked at the flare, then at her. Then at the 7 people behind her, 2 of whom were clearly injured, all of whom were clearly desperate. Emily stood her ground. Her body was positioned in a way that looked natural but wasn't. Weight balanced, the remaining 2 flare cartridges accessible, sight lines to all 3 contacts maintained. She had made a very fast calculation about threat level and motivation, and had landed on not hostile, potentially lost or misidentified, possibly a third-party also dealing with the storm, and had acted on the calculation rather than the fear. "We're a downed military medical team," she said. Her voice carried without being raised. "We have injured personnel. We are not a threat." The 3 figures exchanged a look. Then the one in the center lowered his weapon about 4 inches. Not fully, but enough. "American?" he said. "Yes." Another exchange among them. Then the center figure lowered his weapon fully and held up one hand, palm open. They were search and rescue contractors, private firm hired by a family foundation to search for two missing civilian climbers who'd been lost in the Frostfall before the storm. They'd been out of contact with their own base for 18 hours. They had supplies, a functioning satellite communicator with damaged encryption that was down to one viable frequency, and a man named Korbosh, who knew the Northern Frostfall well enough that his knowledge was immediately, viscerally useful. Emily looked at their satellite communicator for approximately 4 seconds before making another decision. "I need to use that," she said. The contractor with the communicator, Vasquez, according to the name tape, looked at her. "We're on a contracted frequency." "I understand. I need 30 seconds on it." "Ma'am, I can't just—" "Your frequency encryption is down," she said, "which means you know exactly who can hear whatever you transmit. 30 seconds. I'm not asking for a rescue call." She met his eyes. "I'm sending a position update to a frequency that's already listening." He studied her. Whatever he saw in her expression was apparently sufficient. 30 seconds, he said, and handed it over. She didn't make a rescue call. She transmitted a compressed position signal on the frequency she knew, the one that corresponded to the transmitter burst she'd sent from the rock shelter 2 nights ago. 9 seconds of data, coordinates, group count, status code, ETA estimate, wrapped in a format that meant something specific to someone specific and nothing to anyone else. She handed the communicator back. "Thank you," she said. Vasquez looked at the device, then at her. "Who did you just call?" Emily shouldered her pack. "Let's talk about your route," she said. "We should travel together to the next waypoint. Your man Korbach knows the north face. That helps both of us." It wasn't an answer. He knew it wasn't an answer. He looked at her for another moment, then at the injured people behind her, then at the terrain ahead. "Fine," he said. "Combined party. But you tell me who you called." "When we're safe," she said. "I'll tell you everything." She wouldn't, but she'd tell him enough. The combined party moved well. 8 survivors, 3 contractors, 1 man on a sled, 1 man with a wrapped ankle. It was not a clean unit, but it was a functional one. Korbach was the kind of outdoorsman who knew mountain terrain the way musicians know a favorite instrument, by feel more than theory, and Emily fell into a navigation rhythm with him almost immediately, her topographic knowledge and his local pattern reading working in a complementary way that moved the group faster than either could have managed alone. Solis, watching this, pulled Tuck aside at one point. "What is she?" he said quietly. Tuck shook his head. "I've stopped asking." By 1830, they had reached a position that Emily calculated as 6 kilometers from the checkpoint's outer approach perimeter. She called the halt there, at a location Korbach confirmed was the best available shelter on this face, and organized the campsite with a precision that the contractors watched with undisguised attention. Okafor ate without being prompted and kept the food down, which was good. Polly's pupil response had stabilized, not improved, but stabilized, and she'd managed the day's pace without deterioration. Ames's ankle was functional, which was all it needed to be. Emily sat with her back against a spruce trunk, running through the next day's sequence in her head for the 3rd time, checking for gaps. She'd found 2 that concerned her and adjusted for them. She found a 3rd. She adjusted. Vasquez sat down next to her without asking. He was maybe 40, weathered in a working way, and he looked at her with the specific attention of a person who's very good at his job watching someone else who's very good at theirs. "Where'd you serve?" he asked. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Okay," he said. He said it in a tone that indicated he was marking it as information rather than accepting it. She almost said something else. She wasn't sure what stopped her. Habit, probably. Or the lingering calculation that whatever she revealed now would travel, and she'd chosen her life at the creek with specific intention. Except the creek already felt like something from before a line she hadn't known she was crossing. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll be at the checkpoint by midday." Vasquez nodded. "And then?" "Then you find your climbers, and we find out what happens next." She said it neutrally. But the thing she was not saying was already forming in the quiet behind her words, because she knew that when they arrived at that checkpoint, some things were going to have to be said that she'd spent 11 months specifically arranging not to say. And she knew what the 6-second burst from the emergency transmitter had set in motion. and she knew the kind of people who responded to signals on that frequency, and she knew that by midday tomorrow, some of them were probably going to be at or near that checkpoint. She had prepared herself for a lot of things in the past 4 days. She had not quite prepared herself for the moment when her past arrived at the same location as her present, with 5 soldiers as witnesses and a commanding officer somewhere south of here who still believed she was just a nurse he'd left to die on a mountain. Tuck was on watch. The wind had dropped to something almost bearable. Okafor was asleep, breathing steadily, his leg elevated on a folded pack the way Emily had positioned it before she let herself sit down. She closed her eyes for 4 minutes, not to sleep, to think. When she opened them, the wind had picked up again, and on its leading edge, almost certainly imagined, almost certainly her exhausted mind filling in patterns, she thought she heard the distant thrum of rotors. Her hand went to the emergency transmitter in her inner pocket. Still off. She hadn't turned it on again. She didn't need to. Whatever was coming, she had not sent for it with a second signal. She had sent for it 2 days ago, with 9 seconds of data on a damaged satellite communicator, and by her estimate, it had had more than enough time to find the right person, go through the right channels, and result in the right kind of response. She sat in the dark and waited. And somewhere in the airspace above the northern Frostfall Range, something that was not the wind moved through the gap between 2 peaks and kept moving south. Somewhere in the airspace above the northern Frostfall Range, something that was not the wind moved through the gap between 2 peaks and kept moving south. Emily heard it properly at 0312. Not imagined this time. Real, mechanical, the specific frequency signature of military rotors running at a particular RPM that she recognized the way you recognize a voice before you see the face. She was already on her feet when Tuck came off watch and touched her shoulder. "You hear that?" "Yes." "Is that, don't fire anything," she said immediately. "Don't use the flare, don't use a light, don't make a signal. Not yet." He pulled his hand back. "Why not?" "Because I need to know who it is first." He looked at the darkness above them, where the sound was moving. Not toward them, she assessed, but in a holding pattern above the ridgeline, which meant searching rather than transiting. Searching meant they'd picked up something. The position signal, most likely. They had the grid reference, but not the precise ground location. She thought for 3 seconds. Then she took out the emergency transmitter and clicked it on for 4 seconds. A different duration than before. A different code. Specific. The rotor sound shifted. It changed direction by about 20 degrees and the pitch dropped as the aircraft descended. Still not directly overhead. Still working through the terrain, but moving toward them now with the particular purposefulness of a machine whose crew had been given a fix. "Who did you call?" Tuck asked. Emily pocketed the transmitter. "Wake Solis," she said. "Chet." The helicopter, military, unmarked except for a tail identification number that meant nothing to anyone without the right database access, put down on the only flat terrain within 300 meters, a wind-scoured shelf of rock that Korbach had pointed out the previous evening as the only viable landing zone on this face. The rotors didn't stop. 2 people came out. They moved in the dark with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this kind of thing enough times that darkness had stopped being a variable and become just a condition. The first figure reached Emily and stopped. He was maybe 50, compact, with a cold-weather balaclava pushed up to show a face that had the particular weathering of someone who spent significant time at altitude. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "Echo 7, he said, a code she hadn't heard in 11 months. "Clear," she said. Then he looked past her at the group, the survivors, the contractors, Okafor on his sled, Ames with his wrapped ankle, Polly with her carefully managed concussion, and he did a rapid count and assessment that took about 4 seconds and clearly landed somewhere in the range of worse than expected but workable. "How many need immediate medical evac?" he asked. "1 priority 1, sit. Possible slow intracranial, been stable for 18 hours. 1 priority 2, see. Compound tibial fracture, circulation compromised, 1 walking wounded. Supplies? Functionally depleted." He nodded. No reaction to any of it. He turned to the second figure, who had already produced a medical bag from somewhere, and said 2 words Emily didn't catch over the rotors. The second figure moved toward Polly without being directed. "We have room for 5 in the first lift," the man said to Emily. "Take the 3 injured and 2 others. I'll come in the second." He looked at her. You're not coming first? I need to ensure Korbach's party has a clear route out. They have their own situation. There was a beat. Something moved in his expression that wasn't disagreement exactly, more like recognition. The specific recognition of watching someone operate in a mode that he understood personally. Second lift is 40 minutes, he said. Fine. He turned toward the group and began organizing the first extraction with the efficient, unhurried authority of someone who was very good at emergencies. Emily went to Okafor. You're going first, she said. He was already awake, had been awake since the rotors, and his face in the darkness was doing the thing faces do when a thing you've been hoping for becomes real enough to be frightening rather than comforting. Who are these people? They're here to help. That's not an answer. She checked his splint one last time. It had held. It had held for 4 days in conditions that should have broken it, which was not skill. It was luck riding on top of skill, and she was aware of both. Your leg needs a proper surgical evaluation within the next 8 hours. The sooner you're on this helicopter, the better that outcome gets. He looked at her. You're not coming. Second lift. Emily. The first time he'd used her first name. Come on the first lift. She shook her head. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable for both of them. Then he exhaled. You're the most aggravating person I've ever met, he said. I've heard that. And the best. She didn't answer that. She stood up and moved to help with the loading, and Okafor let her go, which was its own kind of answer about the kind of man he was. The first lift took 7 minutes to load and was airborne by 0349. Emily watched it rise above the ridgeline and disappear north, carrying Okafor, Polly, Ames, Tuck, and Nwosu. Solis had argued to stay for the second lift. Ranking officer, he'd said, which was technically correct and also clearly driven by something more than protocol. She'd let him stay. He was steady, and she didn't want to be alone with Korbach's questions for 40 minutes. She needn't have worried. Korbach and his team were occupied with their own situation, their satellite communicator back in action now that they'd linked through the military helicopter's relay, and they were getting coordinates on their missing climbers, alive apparently, sheltered in a crevasse system 4 kilometers north of where anyone had expected. Emily listened to the exchange with half an ear while she broke down the campsite with the thoroughness she'd maintained through every camp. Leave nothing, damage nothing, account for everything. They're going to ask you questions, Solis said next to her. Yes. About who those people are. They will. And you're going to say, I'm going to say what I can, she said. The rest will come out in the review process. He thought about that. There's going to be a review process. Yes. He was quiet for a while, watching her work. Then, Vance? She kept working. He called it off, Solis said. His voice had returned to that flat, cold quality from the conversation 2 nights ago. And the reason he called it off was not based on a complete review of available information, Emily said carefully. That's one way to say it. She tied off the last supply pack, stood. The cold was something abstract now. She'd passed the point where it registered as discomfort and reached the point where it was simply the air. When they debrief you, tell them exactly what you heard and what you experienced, in the order it happened. Don't editorialize. Why are you telling me that? Because editorializing gives people room to argue. Sequence doesn't. He looked at her for a moment. You've been through a formal military review before. She didn't answer. Right, he said. Okay. The second helicopter arrived at 0433. Same type, different crew, but the crew chief had the same quality of movement as the first. People trained for fast insertions and extractions in bad terrain. People for whom this particular situation was an unpleasant variation on a familiar problem. Emily climbed in last. She sat against the fuselage, strapped in, and let her body do what it had been refusing to do for 4 days. Stop, not sleep. Her brain didn't release enough for sleep, but the constant forward pressure of the last 94 hours eased by a fraction, and she sat in the vibrating dark of the helicopter and felt it. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something more complicated. The specific sensation of a thing being over that has also changed something permanently. Solis was across from her, strapped in, eyes forward. At some point during the flight, he looked at her and said, over the rotor noise, "All 7 of us are alive." She nodded. "Because of you." She looked out the window at the mountains receding below. The frostfall was already becoming abstract, already turning from the thing she'd been living inside into the thing she'd been through. She didn't respond to what he'd said, because there wasn't anything to say that would have been true and small enough for a helicopter at 0440. The arrival at Ridgeback Station did not go the way Emily had expected. She'd expected a forward operating checkpoint, a functional facility, medical staff, debriefing officers, the organized response of a system that had been notified a recovery was inbound. What she found, stepping out of the helicopter into the cold pre-dawn of the station's landing pad, was all of that, and also something else. 4 people in civilian clothes with military identification, 2 of whom she recognized. The woman on the left was Major Diane Sellers. She'd been Emily's commanding officer for 3 years, in a unit whose name didn't appear on any public organizational chart. She was 53, with close-cut gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of operating in environments where movement draws attention. She was looking at Emily the way you look at something you've been told to worry about and have found intact. "Carter," Sellers said. "Ma'am, you look terrible." "I've had a difficult week." Something moved at the corner of Sellers' mouth. "We'll get you to medical first. I have injured people who need—" "Already handled," Sellers said. "Okafor's in surgery. The others are being assessed. Your job right now is to let someone check you." Emily's shoulder, the separated one she'd been managing for 4 days without treating, chose that moment to register a specific sharp complaint. She'd been compensating for it unconsciously and hadn't quite realized how much of her energy it had been taking until she stopped moving. "Fine," she said. "And then," Sellers said, "we're going to talk." The medical examination took 40 minutes. The station physician, a compact, efficient woman named Dr. Rourke, who communicated almost entirely through clinical observation rather than conversation, confirmed the shoulder separation, 3 cracked ribs Emily hadn't been certain about, early-stage frostbite on 2 toes on her left foot that she genuinely hadn't noticed, and a core temperature that had been running low enough that Rourke made a specific note in the chart and recommended 4 hours of monitored rewarming before any formal interviews. Sellers overruled the 4-hour recommendation and got it down to 90 minutes by agreeing to conduct the initial interview in the medical bay with heat packs and warm fluids ongoing. Emily didn't argue either side of this negotiation. She sat in the medical bay with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and her shoulder immobilized in a proper sling and her feet in warming wraps, and she drank the worst coffee she'd ever tasted with the specific gratitude of someone who had been cold for 94 hours. Rourke had reset the shoulder. It had not been pleasant. Emily had not made a sound. Rourke had looked at her afterward with a professional assessment. "You've had a shoulder reduction before." "Yes." "How many times?" Emily thought about it. 3, Rourke made a note. "On the left side specifically?" "Twice." Rourke nodded and moved on. She was the kind of doctor Emily respected, interested in the medical facts, uninterested in the story around them. Sellers came in at 0630 with a second person, a man Emily didn't know, late 40s, who was introduced only as Harrington and who sat in the corner with a recording device and the specific quality of attention of someone whose job it was to remember everything. "Start from the crash," Sellers said. Emily started from the crash. She told it the way she told things, sequentially, precisely, with specific times where she had them and estimates where she didn't, flagging the difference between what she'd observed directly and what she'd inferred. She described the shelter construction, the sled, the cache discovery, the patrol signs, Polly's concussion progression, Okafor's circulatory compromise, the contractors, the satellite communicator transmission. She described the radio transmission she'd received from the wrecked helicopter's receiver module on day 1. Harrington's pen stopped moving for a moment, then resumed. She described it exactly. The time, the frequency, the voice, the words. She's a nurse, not a recovery specialist. End the search. Sellers' expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "You're certain of the voice identification?" Sellers asked. "Yes." You'd heard him speak before. 3 times in person. The cadence and delivery were consistent. And the call sign in the transmission? Emily gave it. She'd memorized it from the first second she'd heard it, automatically, because that was how her memory worked for certain categories of information. Harrington wrote it down without looking at the page. Carter, Sellers said. Her voice had shifted into a register that wasn't interrogation and wasn't comfort, something more like the tone of someone about to open a door that's been closed for a long time. Why didn't you transmit your position immediately after the crash? You had the emergency transmitter. Emily had known this question was coming since the moment she'd decided not to activate it. Because a position signal from that transmitter would have identified me, she said, and that identification would have complicated the rescue operation in ways I couldn't control from the ground. Complicated how? Because I didn't know who else was listening on that frequency. I didn't know whether the command structure at Fort Aldrin had access to the classification level that would have explained why a Creek nurse was carrying a unit-issue transmitter. She paused, and I needed to assess the situation before I decided what I was activating. So you waited. I made the group mobile and then I waited until I had a controlled transmission window. Sellers looked at her for a long moment. You were managing the information environment from the ground, in the middle of a survival crisis. Yes. While running a medical response for 7 people. Emily didn't answer that. It wasn't really a question. Sellers exhaled through her nose. Not frustration, more like the exhalation of someone setting down something heavy they've been carrying across the room. All right, the rest of this conversation needs to wait for a formal setting. I need a complete statement recorded on everything you just told me. She glanced at Harrington. We're going to have a problem with Vance. Yes, Emily said. You are. On. The formal statement took 3 hours and covered territory that Emily had not spoken about in 11 months. Not because she'd been ordered not to, exactly. Her separation from the unit had been voluntary, a decision she'd made for reasons she'd been careful to keep private, but because the life she'd built at the Creek had depended on the assumption that nobody would look too carefully at the gap between who she was and who she appeared to be. That gap had now closed itself in the most public and undeniable way available. By 1100, the station's communication channels were running hot. Emily was in a recovery room, technically resting, technically asleep, actually awake, and listening to the quality of movement in the corridor, the pace of footsteps, the frequency of radio traffic, the specific tenor of conversations that stopped when they passed her door. Something was happening. She'd known it would. She'd sent a coded position signal to people who responded to those signals with a specific category of institutional attention, and that attention had now fully arrived and was intersecting with whatever Fort Aldrin Command had said to Ridgeback Station about the downed helicopter and the people on it. The collision of those two things was going to be loud. She lay on the recovery room cot with her immobilized shoulder against a proper pillow for the first time in 4 days and thought about Vance. Not with anger. Anger was expensive, and she'd trained herself out of it as a default response years ago, because in the kind of work she'd done, anger clouded the very assessments that kept you alive. She thought about him clinically, a man who'd made a decision based on incomplete information, or rather, a man who'd made a decision without checking whether his information was complete. The distinction mattered legally. It mattered professionally. He had dismissed her without looking at her file. He had made a call that condemned 7 people based on a category, nurse, that he'd applied without verification. The word he'd used was about competence, but what it had actually expressed in the 3 seconds it had taken to say it was something older and more reflexive than competence. The simple assumption that a woman in a nursing uniform was the thing the uniform said she was, and nothing more. That assumption had a cost. The cost was currently being calculated by people with recording equipment and institutional authority in rooms down the corridor. Emily closed her eyes. At 11:40, the door opened and Sellers came in. She didn't sit. She stood with her arms at her sides, which was how Sellers stood when she was organizing something large. Vance was notified of the survivor's arrival at 0600, she said. His response to command was that the surviving personnel had presumably managed to reach the checkpoint through standard military survival protocols. Emily opened her eyes. He didn't ask about you specifically, Sellers said. No, Emily said. I wouldn't expect him to. He doesn't know you're here. Not yet. Sellers was quiet for a moment. There are investigators inbound from the Joint Accountability Office. They were activated when Harrington's preliminary report went up the chain this morning. This is no longer a station-level incident. Emily sat up, slowly, working around the shoulder. How long until they arrive? 3 hours, maybe less. And Vance? He's been asked to present himself at Ridgeback Station at 1400 for what he's been told is a survivor's debriefing. Sellers paused. He hasn't been told about the investigation. Emily processed this. The timeline it created, the room it gave her. He'll come expecting to manage the narrative. Yes. He won't know I'm here until he walks in. That's correct. There was a long moment. Carter, Sellers said. Her voice had shifted again. Not to command, not to professional assessment, but to something rarer. Something that in 18 years Emily had heard from her maybe 4 times. Something that was close to personal. Your file was in the classified archive, the version that would have shown Vance what you actually were. It was available to him through standard command channels before he made that call. I know. He didn't pull it. I know. Not because he couldn't, because it didn't occur to him to look. Emily stood. The shoulder complained. She straightened anyway. Where do you want me at 1400? She asked. Muttoned. She spent the intervening hours in the medical bay, not because she was required to be there, but because it was where the work was. Rourke had too many patients and too little help. The contractor team had been treated and cleared, but 2 of Emily's survivors still required ongoing monitoring, and Rourke was precise but stretched thin. And Emily had functioning hands and 11 months of nursing practice on top of the other things she had. She checked Polly first. The pupil asymmetry had resolved, both sides equal now, reactive, which meant the intracranial pressure had not progressed to the point of structural intervention. Polly was awake and aware and annoyed about the monitoring leads attached to her chest. You could have told me how bad it was, Polly said. You couldn't have done anything differently, Emily said. Neither could I. So telling you wouldn't have changed anything except made you scared. Polly considered this. That's cold. It's practical. Same thing, coming from you. Emily adjusted the monitoring lead that was pulling at the wrong angle. How's the headache? 4, down from 7. That's real improvement. Yeah, Polly watched her. Those people who came in the helicopters, the ones you knew, yes? Are they going to make things hard for you? Emily looked up. I heard your voice when you talked to them, Polly said. Outside, it sounded different, like, she thought about it, like you had to be careful. I always have to be careful. More careful than usual. Emily straightened. Get some sleep if you can. The headache will be worse if you're tired. You're doing the thing, Polly said. What thing? Where you don't answer, but you do it nicely, so I don't notice as fast. Emily almost smiled. Sleep, she said. Polly closed her eyes but didn't stop watching her through a narrow squint. Emily left the bay and walked to Okafor's room. He was out of surgery. The tibial fracture had required plating, 2 titanium screws and a stabilizing rod, the surgical team had told her when she'd asked, and she'd asked because it was relevant information and she'd needed to know. He was under sedation still, would be for another 2 hours, but his vitals on the monitor were good, and his foot was warm, which meant blood supply had been fully restored. No vascular damage. The splint had held well enough, long enough. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment. Then she turned and went to find somewhere to put herself together before 1400. Colonel Marcus Vance arrived at Ridgeback Station at 1352. Emily knew this because she was watching from a second-floor window that overlooked the vehicle bay, positioned there not by accident. She watched him step out of a staff vehicle in full-dress uniform, which told her something useful. He'd dressed for an audience. He dressed for a room of survivors and station personnel who he expected to manage. He had the posture of a man who'd already decided how this meeting would go. He did not look up. She'd been told to wait in the secondary conference room. The primary conference room was where Vance was being brought. The investigators had arrived at 1310, 3 of them, and they'd spent 40 minutes reviewing Harrington's report and Emily's formal statement and something else. She didn't know what. But the closed-door quality of their preparation had a thoroughness to it that told her they'd come equipped, not coming to collect. At 1358, Sellers came to the secondary room. They're ready, she said. You don't have to go in yet. They'll call you when they need your direct testimony. I know. Vance doesn't know you're here. You said. Sellers stood in the doorway. Carter, when this opens up, and it's going to open up, this is not going to stay contained to a station-level review. It's going to change things for you. The classification on your background will likely need to be partially disclosed to make the negligence finding stick. Emily was standing at the window. She'd changed out of the mountain gear and into fresh station-issue clothing, nothing that indicated rank or affiliation. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like, and also now like something else entirely. And the two things were going to meet in the same room in approximately 6 minutes. I know, she said. You could limit the disclosure. There are ways. Sellers. Emily turned from the window. He left 7 people to die on that mountain because he thought I was a nurse. I am a nurse. I'm also other things. She held her former commanding officer's gaze. He needs to see the file. The whole file. Because the lesson isn't that I'm dangerous. The lesson is that he didn't look. Sellers was quiet. He needs to understand what he dismissed, Emily said. Not for me, because the next time he does this, the next time he looks at someone in a support role and decides they're not worth the paperwork, the next time maybe nobody in that group has a transmitter and 11 months of mountain training and a very good reason to stay alive. Her voice was level and direct and not angry, because she'd made her peace with the anger 3 days ago in a rock shelter while 5 people slept. So yes, disclose the file. Sellers nodded. A single motion, decisive. A radio on Sellers' hip clicked twice. A signal. They're calling for you, Sellers said. Emily walked to the door. Down the corridor in the primary conference room, she could hear the muffled quality of an official proceeding, the particular acoustic flatness of formal speech in a sealed room. She could hear, though she couldn't make out words, a voice that she recognized. Vance. Confident. Managing. She stopped outside the door. One of the investigators, a woman with a JAO identification badge, whose name Emily hadn't caught, opened the door from inside and looked at her. Miss Carter, she said, we're ready for you. Emily stepped through the door. The room was rectangular and harshly lit and contained 4 people. The 3 investigators, Vance and now Emily. Vance was mid-sentence when she entered. She caught the end of it, something about standard protocol assessment, and his voice stopped with the abrupt completeness of a signal cut. He looked at her. She watched the recognition land. The woman from the corridor at the creek, the one he'd waved out of a hallway, the one whose presence he'd never required an explanation for. She watched him recategorize, rapidly and badly. She could see him trying to fit what he was looking at into the shape he already had. It didn't fit. Colonel Vance says, the lead investigator said, this is Emily Carter. She was the senior medical responder for the surviving personnel from the Ridgeback 1 incident. She has provided a formal statement to this inquiry. Vance looked at her for another second, then at the investigators. I wasn't told Please sit down, Colonel, the investigator said. He sat. Emily sat across the table from him. The investigator placed a document on the table between them, a personnel file, tabbed and annotated, a document that had lived in a classified archive for 11 months, while Emily had filed medication logs and restocked supply cabinets in a corridor he'd walked through 3 times. We're going to go through this together, the investigator said. Vance looked at the file, at the name on the cover, at Emily. She met his eyes directly and held them with the same flat, precise attention she'd been applying to everything for the past 4 days. And then the investigator opened the file. The first page was Emily's service record. The second page was her unit designation. The third page was a list of completed operations, survival, recovery, personnel extraction, conducted across 4 years in environments that made the Frostfall Range look like a training simulation. The fourth page was a commendation letter signed by 3 generals. Vance read it. His face did something complicated and involuntary. The lead investigator looked at him across the table. Colonel, she said, can you explain to this inquiry, in your own words, what information you reviewed before authorizing the termination of the Ridgeback 1 search operation? The room was very quiet. Emily waited. And Vance opened his mouth and began to answer, and in the way he answered, the The pauses, the careful construction, the small elisions that showed precisely where his justification was failing to hold. She heard everything she needed to hear. He hadn't looked. He hadn't looked because it hadn't occurred to him to look. And it hadn't occurred to him to look because he'd seen a woman in a nurse's uniform and filed her under a category and moved on. That category had cost 7 people 4 days in the Frostfall Range. That category was now costing him something different. The investigator picked up her pen. Outside the room, down the corridor, the station was running normally. Footsteps, radio traffic, the ordinary procedural sounds of a military facility in operation. Nobody out there knew yet what was happening inside this room. Nobody out there knew that a file had been opened on a table in front of a colonel who had said she's a nurse into a radio on day 1 and believed that was sufficient. But the investigator's pen was moving, and Emily sat across the table and did not look away. And in the archive system at Fort Aldrin, a file that had been quiet for 11 months was being accessed by 7 different terminals simultaneously, as the inquiry began to widen in the way that formal military inquiries widen when the initial question has already found its answer and needs only to document the path. Somewhere in that documentation process, someone pulled the call logs from the day of the crash. The logs were time-stamped. The transmission that had ended the search had been made 4 minutes and 17 seconds after the crash report was filed. 4 minutes. The investigator looked up from the logs at Vance, and the color left his face. And the color left his face. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a room full of people has just watched something become irreversible. The investigator, her name was Captain Lena Dross. Emily had caught it from the badge when she sat down, held the call log printout steady on the table, and let Vance look at it without helping him understand it. He understood it. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The timestamp was not ambiguous. The crash report filed, the search window opened, and then, before anyone had done anything except confirm the aircraft was down, the transmission that closed it. Vance's lawyer, who had been sitting in a chair against the wall in the capacity of a legal advisor rather than active counsel, shifted in his seat. That shift was its own kind of statement. "Colonel," Dross said, "can you account for the specific information you had available at the 4-minute mark?" Vance was looking at the log. Not at Dross, not at Emily, at the paper. "I had the crash coordinates and the initial personnel manifest. The manifest that listed Emily Carter as a medical support specialist." "Yes." "At the nursing grade." "Yes." Dross let the words sit. "Then, did you access her complete service record before making the determination?" The pause was 3 seconds too long. "The manifest indicated her role," Vance said. "In a mountain recovery situation, the relevant qualification is Colonel." Dross set down the log. Her voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, which was more effective than either. "Did you access her complete service record?" Vance put his hands flat on the table. It was a physical management strategy, grounding himself, keeping his body language controlled. Emily had seen it in people under interrogation before. It usually meant the verbal architecture was starting to buckle. "I made a command decision based on available personnel information," he said. "Available," Dross repeated. "The complete service record was available. It was in the same database you accessed for the manifest. It required one additional query." Vance said nothing. Emily said nothing. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched him with the same expression she'd worn through 4 days in the Frostfall. Not cold, not satisfied, just present, paying attention. She'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you could do in a room where truth was being established was to simply be there, undefended, requiring nothing. She required nothing from this moment. The moment was handling itself. "I need to confer with my advisor," Vance said. "Of course," Dross said. "We'll take 15 minutes. But Emily stepped out into the corridor. She walked to the end of it, to a window that looked out over the station's vehicle yard. Trucks, equipment transport, the ordinary infrastructure of a forward military facility, and she stood there and breathed for a while. Her shoulder was a solid ache under the sling. Her feet were still not fully warm. She was running on the particular fuel of the past 94 hours, plus whatever the station coffee was made from, and the gap between what her body needed and what she was asking of it had not yet been negotiated. Solis found her there. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. He still moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing cracked ribs, and the rhythm of it was now as familiar to her as the wind patterns in the Frostfall had been. "How is it going in there?" he asked. "He's conferring with his advisor." Solus leaned against the wall beside the window. He looked like a man who had slept for 4 hours and badly needed 12 more, which was an accurate description. "I gave my statement this morning. All of it. The radio transmission, the shelter, the route, Okafor's leg, everything." "Good." Tuck gave his Nwosu and Ames are scheduled this afternoon. He paused. "Polly's doing hers from the medical bay. Rourke fought them on moving her and apparently won." "Rourke wins those arguments," Emily said. She'd worked with her for less than 12 hours, but the pattern was already clear. Solus was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's something you should know before you go back in." She looked at him. Vance's aide, the one who was with him when he arrived, he was talking to the station comms officer before the meeting. I heard part of it. He chose his words carefully. He was asking about which survivors had already given statements and whether any of them had made specific claims about radio transmissions. Emily absorbed this. He was trying to find out what the inquiry had before Vance walked in. "Yes." "That's not unusual." "No, but the way he asked..." Solis stopped. It sounded like preparation, like they'd been expecting this. She thought about that. About Vance arriving in dress uniform, managing his posture, the confidence she'd read as the assumption of control. She reconsidered that reading. Not just confidence. Preparation. Which meant someone had told him more than they should have. She said, "Stay available. If the investigators want a second round with you, don't limit what you say based on anything you think has already been established." He nodded. He understood what she was really saying. The shape of this thing was larger than a single bad call on a radio. That shape was still becoming clear. "Carter," he straightened, worked around the rib complaint. "Whatever happens in there, you don't have to protect us from the information anymore. We're not on the mountain." She almost said something sharp, caught it. He was right, and the fact that it felt strange to receive rather than manage was her problem, not his. "I know," she said. "Okay." He pushed off the wall. "I'm going to check on Ames. His ankle's going to need surgery, and he keeps telling Rourke it doesn't. Tell him Rourke wins those arguments too." She heard him make a sound that was almost a laugh as he walked away. When the 15 minutes were up and Emily returned to the conference room, the arrangement had changed. Vance's legal advisor was now seated at the table rather than against the wall, and Vance himself had the quality of a man who had made a decision he wasn't happy with, but had accepted as the least bad available option. He had that look because the decision was a controlled disclosure. She understood this before anyone said a word. He was going to admit to a process failure and frame it as a gap in briefing structure rather than a personal failure of judgment. He was going to make it a systems problem. It was a reasonable legal strategy. It would reduce the severity of findings. It would not eliminate them. Dross produced a second document. Emily recognized it even before Dross announced what it was. The radio communications log from Fort Aldrin for the 6-hour window around the crash. The full log. Not just the outbound transmission she'd heard, but the incoming traffic preceding it. "We've been reviewing the communication sequence," Dross said. "In the 14 minutes before your transmission terminating the search, there were 3 incoming calls to your command channel. Can you identify the originating parties?" Vance looked at the log. Those would be standard check-in calls from "The originating party IDs are here." Dross tapped the document. The second call, at the 4-minute mark, came from an internal Fort Aldrin channel registered to Administrative Services. A beat. "Administrative Services called your command line within 4 minutes of the crash report," Dross said. Vance was very still. "Do you know what that call contained?" "I would need to review..." The audio record of that call was preserved in the Fort Aldrin archive. Dross said it neutrally, the way people say things that have already stopped being a surprise to them. "We've listened to it. It will be part of this record." Emily watched Vance's legal advisor put his pen down on his notepad. She watched Vance look at the document in a way that indicated he was not reading it because he already knew what it said. The thing that had been a command failure was becoming something with a different shape. A call from Administrative Services. Not operational, not medical, not logistics, but administrative, in the first 4 minutes, before any assessment had been completed, before anyone could reasonably have evaluated the survival odds or the available personnel or anything except the raw fact that an aircraft was down. Someone had called, and someone had answered, and 4 minutes later the search was over. I'm going to need the content of that call included in my formal inquiry response, Vance said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. The managed quality, the architecture. What was left was flatter and less controlled, and Emily thought more honest. Before I continue answering questions. That's your right, Dross said. We'll recess. The recess lasted 2 hours. Emily used part of it in the medical bay because Okafor was coming out of sedation and she wanted to be there when he did. She'd told herself it was clinical. She wanted to assess his initial post-sedation responses, check his orientation, verify the sensory return in his foot. These things were true. They were also not the only reason. He opened his eyes at 15:42, blinked twice at the ceiling, found her face. The checkpoint, he said. His voice was the thick, dragging quality of someone pulling themselves back through sedation. We made it. We made it, she said. He was quiet for a moment, processing where he was, what the tubes and the monitoring leads meant, what the absence of cold and wind meant. Then, my leg. Successful surgery, plate and screws. You'll be on crutches for 8 weeks and you'll need PT, but you'll have full function. He exhaled, long and slow. And the others? Polly is stable. Ames needs ankle surgery, which Rourke has apparently already scheduled over his objections. Tuck and Nwosu are cleared. Solis? Managing his ribs. Being difficult about resting. A weak sound that was attempting to be a laugh. Then, and you? Shoulder, ribs, toes, all manageable. He turned his head to look at her directly. His eyes were more focused now, the sedation clearing in the way it does, not gradually, but in a series of distinct arrivals. There's something happening here. I can hear it in the corridor traffic, people moving with a purpose. She didn't insult him by pretending otherwise. There's a formal inquiry. It's expanding. Expanding how? She considered how much of it was hers to tell. There may be more to the termination of the search than a single command decision. He looked at her for a moment. His face was pale from blood loss and surgery, and 4 days in the Frostfall, and it still managed to convey the specific alertness of a man reassembling the picture. Someone pushed him. Emily said nothing. Carter, you'll be formally interviewed when you're medically cleared, she said. Tell them what you experienced and what you heard. In sequence. You know the rest. He held her eyes. You've been 3 steps ahead of this since day 1. I've been surviving, she said. Same as you. It's not the same as me, he said. But he said it without rancor, as observation, almost as respect. Not even close. She checked his foot temperature one more time, confirmed the circulation, noted it in the chart. Rest, she said. You keep saying that to people. People keep needing it. She left the medical bay and walked back toward the conference corridor, and the sound of the station around her had shifted again. More voices, more radio traffic, a different quality of urgency. Something had happened during the recess. Sellers met her in the corridor. The audio record from the Fort Aldrin call, Sellers said. The one from Administrative Services. Yes. The originating party wasn't administrative staff. Sellers' voice was controlled and very even. The channel was registered to Administrative Services, but it was operated by Colonel Vance's Deputy Operations Officer, Major Alan Trent. Emily stopped. Trent made the call, Sellers said, from an administrative channel rather than his ops channel, which means it wouldn't appear in the standard operations log. She paused. But it does appear in the comprehensive archive, which the inquiry team pulled this morning. What was on the call? The inquiry has it. I've heard a summary. Sellers looked at her squarely. Trent told Vance that the downed aircraft had medical personnel only, that there were no extraction-qualified personnel among the survivors, and that the weather window made the rescue cost prohibitive. Emily was quiet. He gave Vance the exact wrong information, Sellers said, with enough confidence and enough speed that Vance made the call without checking. Trent had access to the full manifest, Emily said. Yes, he knew what was in my personnel file. He had clearance for it, yes. Emily felt something shift in her assessment of the past 4 days. Not change exactly, but deepen. The picture she'd been working from had been a smaller picture. Vance making a fast, careless decision based on incomplete information. That was negligence. That was damaging and consequential, but it was at some level a recognizable human failure. This was different. Trent's being brought in? She asked. He's been asked to present himself at Ridgeback Station, Sellers said. He doesn't know why. Emily stood in the corridor and thought about a man who had looked at a personnel file, understood exactly what was in it, and then told his superior the opposite. She thought about the 4 minutes, the speed of it, the precision. Not a careless dismissal, a deliberate one. Why? Sellers, she said, is there a connection between Trent and the Frostfall Range mission specifically, outside of the standard operational chain? Sellers looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes. That's what the inquiry is trying to establish, she said, which meant they already suspected there was. Chunk. Vance's formal statement, when it resumed at 16:15, was a controlled unraveling. He confirmed that he'd received the call from Trent. He confirmed that he'd acted on Trent's assessment without cross-referencing it against the manifest or the personnel files. He confirmed that the decision to terminate the search had been made in under 5 minutes, on the basis of information provided verbally by a subordinate through a channel that was not standard for operational decisions. He did not say that Trent had lied to him. He was careful not to say it, because that would have been an accusation, and accusations required a different procedure. But the logical gap between what he did say and what that information implied was not subtle. Dross asked her questions precisely and without visible reaction. Emily answered them the same way. The room contained, over the course of 90 minutes, the complete narrative of a decision that had condemned 7 people. A decision built on 4 minutes, a misidentified channel, a deliberate misinformation, and the assumption that a nurse was only a nurse. At 17:20, Dross closed her notebook. Colonel Vance, she said, you are formally notified that this inquiry will include findings relating to command negligence and process failure in the Ridgeback 1 incident. You will receive formal notice of specific findings within 72 hours. You are advised to retain legal representation beyond advisory capacity. Vance nodded. His face had the specific quality of a man in the moment just after something has been detonated. Not the destruction itself, but the instant of comprehension that the detonation has occurred and cannot be undone. He looked at Emily once as he stood. She met his eyes. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the past 4 days hadn't already said better. He left the room. Emily sat for another moment. The thermal in the room felt different now. Heavier or emptier, she wasn't sure which. Ms. Carter, Dross said, I want to be transparent with you. The inquiry's scope has widened significantly. What began as a command negligence review is now a potential deliberate misconduct case. Major Trent's involvement changes the nature of the findings. I understand. This means your testimony will likely be required at a formal proceeding, not just a station-level inquiry. It may require a partial disclosure of your classified background. Major Sellers and I have already discussed disclosure, Emily said. I've authorized it. Dross looked at her. You don't want to think about it further? I've been thinking about it for 4 days, Emily said. I made my decision on a mountain. Dross made a note. There's one additional development I need to inform you of. She set down her pen. Major Alan Trent arrived at the station 20 minutes ago. He's in the secondary conference room. He does not know the inquiry has audio from the Fort Aldrin call. Emily held Dross's gaze. He's asked to speak with you directly, Dross said, before his formal interview. A pause. Why? Emily asked. He hasn't said, but he specifically requested you by name. Dross watched her. You don't have to agree to it. Emily thought about a call made in 4 minutes through a misregistered channel. She thought about a man who'd looked at her file and understood exactly who she was and had chosen to make her invisible anyway. She thought about why. Yes, she said. I'll speak with him. Dross straightened. I'll have someone accompany— Alone, Emily said. Another pause. Dross assessed her. I'll be outside the door, Dross said. Emily nodded, stood, and walked toward the secondary conference room. Whatever Trent had wanted to say to her, whatever calculation had driven him to ask for this, she was going to hear it with her recorder running, her memory engaged, and the full understanding that every word he said in that room was going to matter. She put her hand on the door. She opened it. Trent was sitting at the table, in civilian clothes, not in uniform. That was the first thing. The second was his expression. Not defiant, not managed. Something rawer than that. The third thing was the document on the table in front of him. It was a photograph, printed on plain paper, centered on the table, oriented toward the door so that whoever walked in would see it immediately. Emily looked at it. It was a photograph of her, taken from a distance, in a location she recognized, the parking structure at Silver Creek Medical Center, taken by the angle and the light, approximately 6 weeks ago. She looked at Trent. Sit down, he said. His voice was steady, but costing him something to keep that way. There are things you don't know about why the search was ended. Emily sat down. She put her hands flat on the table, not for grounding the way Vance had done, but because she wanted them visible. And she looked at him and waited. Outside the door, the station continued its ordinary business. Inside the room, something that had been moving toward Emily Carter for reasons she didn't yet fully understand was about to arrive at the table and name itself. Trent's hands were on the table too, mirroring her without intending to. And the document between them, the photograph of her in the Silver Creek parking structure, taken from a distance 6 weeks ago, sat there like something that had been waiting a long time to be looked at by the right people in the same room. Emily looked at him, not at the photograph, at him. Talk, she said. He didn't arrange himself first, didn't build to it. Whatever preparation he'd had, it had run out somewhere between being called to Ridgeback Station and sitting in this chair. There's a contracting group, he said, private. They've been running extraction and personnel recovery operations in the northern border territories for 18 months. Unofficial. Off book. He stopped. Started again. The Frostfall Range mapping exercise, the one you were on, it was going to intersect with their operating zone. The route your team was charting would have documented terrain that they'd been using specifically because it wasn't documented. Emily said nothing. Let him keep going. When the helicopter went down, there was a decision made, not by Vance, by someone above Vance's awareness, that a rescue operation running into that grid was a problem. Trent's voice was careful and flat, the tone of a man recounting something he'd participated in and was only now hearing himself say out loud. I was told to make the call go away. I was told what to tell Vance. I was given the language. Given by who? He looked at her. Trent, she said. Given by who? A man named Caldwell. He's not military. He runs the contracting group. A pause. He had leverage on me, personal, separate from this situation. He'd been holding it for 8 months. Emily held his gaze. She understood leverage. She understood the specific paralysis of someone holding information that could destroy things you'd built. She didn't soften toward him for it. A man had used 4 minutes and a misregistered phone channel to leave 7 people to die in a mountain range. But she filed the information exactly as it was, without adding contempt to it and without removing the reality of what it meant. The photograph, she said. Caldwell took it, or had it taken. Trent pushed it slightly toward her. He knew you were on that helicopter before it lifted. He knew what you were. I don't know how... I didn't know about your background until I pulled your file when I got the assignment. And when you pulled the file, I understood why he wanted the search ended. He exhaled. Someone with your operational history gets to that terrain, starts asking questions about why there are boot prints that don't belong to any party on the mission. He knew you'd figure it out. He needed you and that team not to come back. The words landed simply, the way facts do when they're not trying to be anything other than what they are. He hadn't called off the search because of carelessness or category assumption. He'd called it off because someone had correctly identified Emily Carter as a specific threat to a specific operation, and had used Vance as an instrument and Trent as the mechanism, and had done it in 4 minutes because 4 minutes was all it took when you already had the leverage in place. She thought about the boot prints she'd steered them away from on day 2. The deliberate search pattern. Those hadn't been a third-party patrol managing their own situation. They'd been looking for survivors. Caldwell sent people in, she said. Yes. Not to rescue. No. She sat back. The shoulder complained. She let it. Outside the door, she could hear Dross's footsteps, the slow, controlled pace of someone waiting with professional patience. Inside the room, the air had the quality of a space where something large has just been fully named. Why are you telling me this? Emily asked. You could have come in, given them nothing, let the inquiry find what it finds. Trent looked at the table. Because Caldwell told me this morning that if the inquiry got too close, he had contingencies, for me and for... He stopped. She waited. He mentioned you by name, Trent said. Said there were other photographs, other surveillance, that he had people positioned. He looked up. I don't know if it's real or a threat. With Caldwell, I've never been able to tell the difference. Emily made a decision in approximately 2 seconds. She stood, went to the door, and opened it. Dross looked at her. I need Sellers, Emily said. Now. And whoever is running your communication security. We have a secondary subject. Dross's expression didn't change, but something behind it accelerated. How immediate? Dross said. Treat it as immediate until we know otherwise. Dross moved. Emily came back into the room. Trent was still sitting, his hand still on the table, looking like a man who'd put down something he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing the weight and was now noticing the absence. You're going to tell them everything you told me, she said. The same way, in sequence. Caldwell's name, the leverage, the contracting group, the boot prints on the mountain, all of it. It ends my career, he said. Yes, she said. It does. He nodded, slowly. It was not the nod of a man who'd made peace with it. It was the nod of a man who'd calculated the remaining options and found only one that he could live inside of. She didn't dress it up for him. There's a recorder on the table, she said. I'm going to start it before Dross comes back. So what you said to me is on record before it goes anywhere else. She looked at him. You understand why? He understood. If Caldwell had reached into military channels, which he clearly did, an unrecorded verbal disclosure could disappear or be reshaped. A timestamp on a recording in Emily's possession was harder to make disappear. He nodded again. She started the recorder. 1. What happened in the next 6 hours was not clean, and it was not simple, and it moved through channels that Emily was only partly aware of, because once Caldwell's name entered the formal record, it triggered a notification sequence that went to agencies outside the military inquiry structure. And those agencies had been watching a particular contracting group for reasons entirely separate from a downed helicopter in the Frostfall Range. She learned this from Sellers at 2100 in the station's small break room, over coffee that was marginally better than the previous batch. Caldwell's organization has been on a federal watch list for 14 months, Sellers said. Unauthorized extraction operations, suspected collaboration with non-state actors in the border territories, financial irregularities that go about 4 layers deep before they stop being traceable. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Your Frostfall mapping mission would have charted a route that passed within 2 kilometers of a facility they've been running out of a decommissioned mining complex on the northern face. Emily thought about the terrain she'd navigated around, the way the old glacier bed had been the right call for Ames's ankle, and also, she now understood, for reasons that had nothing to do with ankles. Caldwell targeted the mission specifically, she said. The mission and you. He knew about the transmitter frequency. We don't know yet how, but he did. He knew that if anyone on that helicopter survived long enough to use it, a specific kind of response would follow. Sellers looked at her. He was trying to close the window before it opened. He was 4 days too late, Emily said. Yes. Because I didn't use the transmitter immediately. Yes. A pause. Which he hadn't accounted for. She thought about that. The thing that had saved them, the decision she'd made in the first hour to assess before transmitting, had been the one variable in Caldwell's calculation that he couldn't have predicted. Because he'd been working from a profile of who she was and who she was operationally, and he'd assumed she would do the fastest and most effective thing available. He hadn't accounted for the fact that her fastest available decision was to wait. She drank her coffee. Trent's statement is complete? She asked. Full recorded disclosure, JAO has it. Federal agencies have been notified. Sellers set her mug down. Caldwell's facility in the Frostfall was raided by a joint team at 1900. He was in it. Emily looked at her. He's in custody, Sellers said. 3 of his personnel, including the 2 who were running the patrol you avoided on day 2, are also in custody. The facility had documentation on the contracting operations going back 11 months. Emily was quiet for a moment. He had photographs of you going back 8 weeks, Sellers said. Her voice had something in it that was not quite anger. Anger had been retired, the way it gets retired when there's enough information to make it irrelevant. We don't know how he identified you when you were assigned to the creek. We're working on that. It doesn't matter much now, Emily said. It matters for the investigation. Yes, for the investigation, she amended. It matters. They sat with the bad coffee in the break room and the station's night noise around them. The shift change sounds, the radio traffic, the distant rumble of a vehicle on the access road. And Emily let herself feel, for the first time since the crash, the full weight of what had actually happened. Not just the mountain. Not just the cold and the sled and Okafor's leg and 4 days of calculated survival. The larger thing. That she had been specifically, deliberately targeted. That someone had looked at her file, understood who she was, and decided she was a problem to be erased rather than a person to be found. And she had survived it by being exactly what she was. Not despite the person she'd become at the creek. The quiet one, the thorough one, the woman who moved through rooms without disturbing them. Because of her. Because 11 months of learning to be invisible had also been 11 months of learning to be still. And stillness, in a crisis, was sometimes the only thing that kept you alive. She didn't say this to Sellers. She sat with it. What happens now? She asked. To Caldwell. Federal prosecution. The military misconduct findings for Vance will run parallel. Sellers looked at her. He's been suspended pending the formal inquiry conclusion. That's not public yet, but it will be within 48 hours. And Trent? Cooperation agreement, reduced findings. He'll leave the service. Sellers said it without sympathy and without the absence of it. He made choices. He did, Emily said. Carter. Sellers set down her mug. There's a conversation we need to have about what comes next for you. Emily looked at her. The inquiry findings, when they go public, are going to include a partial disclosure of your background, enough to establish the negligence, enough to make the case for what was lost when the search was terminated. She folded her hands. You're not going to be able to go back to the creek and be invisible anymore. Emily had known this since the moment she'd told Sellers to disclose the file. She'd known it before that, probably. Somewhere in the Frostfall, in one of the nights she'd been awake while everyone else slept, it had already settled into her as an irreversible fact. I know, she said. So, I need some time. You have time. Sellers paused. But I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as someone who ran your unit for 3 years and not as your superior officer, because technically, I'm not that anymore. Emily waited. You were extraordinary out there, Sellers said. Not because of your training, though the training was part of it, because of what you chose to do with it. You kept 7 people alive in conditions that would have killed a team operating at full capacity with full supplies. You did it while managing your own injuries, reading a threat environment with degraded equipment, and making strategic decisions about information that protected the group without deceiving them about what they needed to know. She stopped. That's not something the unit teaches. We teach components of it. What you did with those components on that mountain. She stopped again, which was unusual for Sellers, who rarely stopped unless it was deliberate. I didn't do everything right, Emily said. No. I should have caught Okafor's splint pressure sooner. I should have read Paulie's progression faster. Ames's ankle. I pushed the pace on day 3 beyond what was safe for him, and the terrain choice was mine. Yes, Sellers said, and everyone got home. They looked at each other. I want you back, Sellers said. It was direct and without decoration. Not necessarily in the same capacity, but we're building something new. Personnel recovery, crisis response, integration between medical and field operations. It's the gap that this incident just put a spotlight on the size of a runway. She held Emily's gaze. Your name is going to be associated with this inquiry whether you want it or not. I'd rather you choose how that association becomes useful." Emily was quiet for a long time. "Let me think about it," she said. "Fair," Sellers said. 3 weeks later, the inquiry findings were published. They ran to 47 pages and covered the Ridgeback 1 crash, the termination of the search operation, the communication sequence through the misregistered Fort Aldrin channel, and the connection to the Caldwell contracting group. The findings identified 2 primary failures: Colonel Marcus Vance's command negligence in making a personnel determination without completing standard record review, and Major Alan Trent's deliberate misrepresentation of survivor capabilities under direction from an external party. Vance was formally reprimanded, stripped of his command at Fort Aldrin, and placed on administrative hold pending further review. The finding of command negligence was entered into his permanent record. He retained his rank pending a separate proceedings panel. The panel's outcome, when it came 6 weeks after that, resulted in a mandatory early retirement. His career ended not with a court-martial, but with a paper trail that said, in the flat language of institutional findings, that he had made a lethal decision without doing the minimum required work to make it correctly. There was no drama in it, no public confrontation, no cameras, just a finding, a record, a door that closed. Trent received an administrative discharge under a cooperation framework. He left the service without ceremony. Emily didn't think about him much. She'd thought about him enough in the break room at Ridgeback Station, and what she'd concluded was that he was a man who'd made a bad choice under pressure from a worse man, and that the distinction mattered without excusing the outcome, and that the system was handling it in the way systems handle things, imperfectly, but in the direction of accountability. That was what accountability looked like in practice. Not satisfying exactly. Accurate. Caldwell was charged federally on 7 counts, including unauthorized military contracting operations, surveillance of a protected personnel record, and conspiracy to obstruct a military rescue operation, the last charge carrying the heaviest weight and the longest potential sentence. His organization was dismantled. The facility in the Frostfall was decommissioned and documented, and the documentation became part of a broader federal case involving 3 separate contracting groups operating in the border territories. He entered a not guilty plea and retained expensive legal counsel, and the case moved into the long, grinding process of federal prosecution, where it would live for years before it resolved, as these cases do, in ways that were legally precise and humanly unsatisfying and ultimately irreversible. Emily followed the initial filings and then stopped following them. She knew how the ending went. She had done her part to make it possible. The ceremony was at Fort Aldrin 6 weeks after the findings were published. Emily hadn't wanted a ceremony. She'd said so to Sellers, who had said the word ceremony with the tone of someone who was not conveying information but announcing a completed fact. The Distinguished Service Medal was being awarded. The awarding of it required witnesses, and it would have them. She drove herself there on a Tuesday morning in early February. The shoulder had healed to the point where she was driving without the sling. The toes were fine. The ribs she stopped noticing somewhere around week 4, which was roughly when she'd stopped being angry at them for existing. The ceremony was in a conference room rather than a parade ground, because February and Raven Hollow had decided to demonstrate the same weather logic that had put a helicopter into the Frostfall Range 3 months earlier. This seemed appropriate to Emily in a way she didn't explain to anyone. Okafor was there on crutches, which he handled with the same stoic pragmatism he'd brought to everything. Tuck was there, and Nwosu and Polly, whose head was fully cleared and who had apparently argued with 3 separate administrative personnel about the dress code for the event before arriving in civilian clothes anyway. Ames was there with a walking boot and the look of someone who had been forced to rest for 6 weeks against his nature and had very strong feelings about it. Solis was there in dress uniform, his ribs healed, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has been through something with people and is in the room with those people and is aware of all of it. He caught Emily's eye when she walked in and nodded. She nodded back. There were senior officers present, a general she didn't know personally, 2 colonels, the JAO team lead who had run the inquiry. Sellers was in the back row, in civilian clothes, which was a choice Emily understood and appreciated. The general spoke. He used words like extraordinary and courage and above and beyond. He was not wrong about any of it, And the words were also not quite the thing they were trying to describe, because the thing itself, 4 days, 2 injuries that should have been worse, a mountain that didn't care whether you lived or died, a series of decisions made in cold and dark with incomplete information and no certainty of outcome. That thing didn't fit inside the words that ceremonies used. That was fine. Ceremonies weren't for precision. They were for witness. When he pinned the medal to her uniform jacket, Emily looked at the back of the room rather than at him. A reflex or a choice. She wasn't sure. Then it was over, and people stood, and someone had arranged for coffee and food at the back of the room, and the gathered personnel dispersed into the informal configuration that follows formal things. Okafor found her first. He moved on the crutches with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had decided to be good at them. "Carter," he said. "How's the leg?" "Functional. 6 more weeks." He stood in front of her and looked at her with the direct attention he'd been aiming at her since day 2 on the mountain, the look of a man who had been in the process of revising something for 3 months. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything." "I know." He adjusted his weight on the crutches. "I keep thinking about that first morning. You were up before everyone. You had water heating." "The altitude makes dehydration worse," she said. "I know that's not the point I'm making." She almost smiled. "You didn't have to do any of it the way you did it," he said. "You could have used the transmitter on day 1. You could have told us what you were, what you knew, given us something to hold on to. You chose not to because you thought it would slow us down. You made that call for 7 people without asking any of us." He paused. "I want you to know I'm not saying it as a criticism." "What are you saying it as?" "As, I don't know, as someone who has spent 12 years believing he understood what competence looked like and found out he had a gap in that understanding." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, something between respect and something more personal than respect. "You're the best I've ever worked with. I've worked with exceptional people. I need you to know I know that." Emily looked at him. There were things she could have said. She thought of several. She let most of them pass. "You pulled your own weight the whole way," she said. "On a broken leg, on a sled, in -30. You didn't make it harder." That's a very low bar. In survival situations, it's the only bar. He smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile. It changed his face into something younger and less armored. "When you figure out what you're doing next," he said, "let me know. I'd work with you again." "I might take you up on that," she said. He moved on, navigating the room on the crutches with the same dignified refusal to be inconvenienced that he'd brought to 4 days on a mountain sled. Tuck appeared at her elbow approximately 30 seconds later with a plate of food he was offering her with the direct practicality of someone who has noticed that she doesn't eat unless presented with food at close range. "Eat," he said. "You've been spending time with me too long," she said. "Probably." He held the plate until she took it. "There's a thing I've been wanting to ask." "Ask?" "The cache on day 2. The forward emergency supply cache. You navigated us onto that route on purpose." "Yes." "How far in advance did you plan it?" "Day 1, she said. "When I was doing the initial route assessment." He absorbed this. "You planned our escape route while you were still in the crash." "I was assessing options. It's not planning, it's Carter." "Yes," she said. "I planned it in the crash." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in the particular admiration of someone who has had enough time to process something that initially exceeded their framework. "I'm going to apply for the Mountain Operations Training Program," he said. "The new one. The one that's using your Frostfall decisions as curriculum." She looked at him. "Sellers mentioned it," he said with the specific expression of someone who knows they've said something that lands. Sellers had mentioned it to her too, in passing, as if it were a small thing. A training program for integrated medical and field recovery operations, using documented case studies from the inquiry findings as teaching material. The Frostfall recovery, the shelter construction, the sled design, the cache navigation, the concussion monitoring protocol, the civilian contractor integration, as a model for what combined field medical decision-making could look like. Her decisions, as curriculum. She ate the food from the plate and thought about that. She thought about the hours she'd spent in the Frostfall making calls she'd been too busy to second-guess. She'd only second-guessed them afterward, in the recovery room at Ridgeback Station, in the space between sedation and real sleep, going through each one and finding the gaps she'd missed. The gaps were real. The gaps were going to end up in the curriculum too, because that was what good training used. Not the clean version of what happened, the actual version, with the missed pressure point on Okafor Splint and the pace miscalculation on day 3 and the 8 hours it had taken her to tell Solis about the radio transmission. The gaps were going to teach people as much as the decisions, maybe more. She told Sellers yes 2 weeks after the ceremony, in a phone call that lasted 6 minutes, not a full return to active operations. A consulting and development role, building the curriculum, running the training scenarios, working with the medical and field operations integration program that was in early architecture and needed someone who understood both sides of the gap from the inside. It wasn't what she'd been before. It wasn't nursing at the creek. It was something that didn't have a clean job title yet, which seemed appropriate. She left Silver Creek Medical Center on a Friday in late February. Major Harlow said she'd been thorough, which was the same thing he'd said in her performance review, and she thanked him for it the same way she'd thanked him then. Genuinely, without irony, because thorough was not nothing, and he wasn't wrong. She drove out of Raven Hollow on the Northern Highway, headed toward a posting that didn't have a publicly listed address, on a role that wouldn't appear on any organizational chart, to do work that nobody would know she was doing until it showed up in the decisions of people who trained under the program she was building. The Frostfall Range came into view on her right about 20 miles out of town, filling the horizon with the particular white severity of mountains that don't apologize for what they are. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked back at the road. What she understood, that she hadn't fully understood before, was this. The problem had never been that she was invisible. The problem had been that she'd chosen to be, and had forgotten that the choice was hers. Invisibility as a strategy and invisibility as a condition were two different things, and somewhere in 11 months of quiet hallways and restocked supply cabinets, she'd let the strategy become the condition. The mountain had corrected that. Not because the mountain cared. The mountain absolutely did not care. It had the profound indifference of all things that are old and large and unconcerned with human arrangements. But in that indifference, in 4 days of cold and dark and no one coming, she'd had to be exactly what she was, not the version she'd decided to be. The full thing. And the full thing had been enough. Not perfect, not seamless, not the clean cinematic version of competence, but enough. Enough for 7 people. Enough to light a flare in the right direction. Enough to recognize boot prints in the snow and steer around them. Enough to hold a splint together with aircraft cargo strapping and 2 frozen hands and 33 years of being underestimated by people who didn't look past the surface. A man had said she's a nurse into a radio and meant it as a verdict. She'd been a nurse. She'd also been everything he hadn't looked at. And the thing that nobody told you, the thing that ceremonies and medals and public findings couldn't quite capture, was that she hadn't become those things in defiance of being dismissed. She'd become them long before. The dismissal had just created the conditions where it could no longer be managed around. You could spend years making yourself smaller than you are, and the world would accommodate you. The world was very good at accommodation. It would take the version of you that you offered and treat it as the complete product and never ask what else was in the box. But if the box got dropped from 9,000 feet into a mountain range in late November, the contents had a way of making themselves known. She drove north. The Frostfall shrank in her rear-view mirror and then disappeared behind a curve, and she was on a straight road through white country with the heat on and a posting ahead of her, and the particular feeling of a person who has walked out of one version of their life into another without quite finding the seam between them. It wasn't relief exactly. It wasn't triumph. It was the feeling of being the right size. She kept driving.